Beyond Myth and Metaphor: The Case of Narrative in Digital Media by Marie-Laure Ryan. This paper challenges narratological means to understand video games and dismisses them as reductionist. The mode of interactivity is emphasized here, which is crucial to games, and the fact that narratives are not a necessity for games, but often either emergent on basis of the player's preconceived ideas and theories of understanding. Meaning that if I read a Marxist book before I play a game, it is more likely for me to see a Marxist narrative in the game than the other way around, which indicates that games do not hold always narratives intrinsically. Whereas software developers adapt narrative concepts to business programs, in a typically metaphorical transfer, media theorists invoke what I call narrative myths to promote literary or entertainment forms of digital textuality. Therefore, the paper wants to clear up with narrative myths, which are defined as the Aleph or holodeck myth. The Aleph myth is based on the idea that a set of infinite and finite numbers can create a number of infinite sequences. In the context of this paper, it addresses the overexcitement of scholars to think of cybertext such as games as possibilities to experience unlimited amounts of narrative possibilities. This is however dismissed by Ryan as utopian, as players remain bound to forms of knowledge and expectations that humans have, and logical preconditions such as space, time, and causality. Textual fragments are like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Some fit easily together and some others do not, because of their intrinsic shape or narrative content. It is simply not possible to construct a coherent story out of every permutation of a set of textual fragments, because fragments are implicitly ordered by relations of logical presupposition, material causality, and temporal sequence. This means that just because a game designer would decide to have a game with completely random narrative elements in forms of in-game texts, voiceovers, descriptions, animations, and choices, does not mean that we'd be able to conceive a cohesive narrative from it. The second myth, the holodeck myth, addresses Janet Murray's idea of the future of gaming, that we would be embodying avatars in virtual worlds and experience all kinds of emotions in these simulations while becoming authors of our stories at the same time. The creation of narrative and stories here again at the forefront, what gaming is thought of in a narratological sense. This is however dismissed by Ryan on the basis that players do not necessarily enjoy this intense form of embodiment. Ryan indicates that games are a place where we can be spectator and actor at the same time. We can experience intense situations and emotions from a safe spot. Moreover, it is not necessary for us to create narratives as main activity in games, as experiencing narratives as active spectators is what makes games enjoyable for many players. If we consider the whole gamut of fictional characters, which ones would we really like to play? Hamlet, Emma Bovary, Gregor Samsa in the Metamorphosis, Oedipus, Anna Karenina, the betrayer Brutus, and Julius Caesar? Or would we rather be characters such as the dragon-slaying hero of Russian fairy tales, Alice in Wonderland, Harry Potter, or Sherlock Holmes? As far as I'm concerned, I would pick a character from the second list, which means a rather flat character, whose involvement in the plot is not emotional, but rather a matter of exploring a world, solving problems, performing actions, competing against enemies, and above all, dealing with interesting objects in a concrete environment. This kind of involvement is much closer to playing a computer game than to living a Victorian novel or Shakespearean drama. This highlights an important point, namely that games are often played for their dynamic character and activity, in which, to put it plainly, we get to do something, instead of listening and reading through the pain of someone. To provide a new perspective on games through which the aspect of interactivity is, highlighted, Ryan proposes a number of parameters through which we can try to analyze games. And these parameters are on an axis of internal and external. In the internal mode, the user projects himself as a member of the fictional world, either by identifying with an avatar or by apprehending the virtual world from a first-person perspective. In the external mode, the reader situates himself outside the virtual world. Then we have also the other axis, which is the exploratory and the ontological one. In the exploratory mode, the user is free to move around the database, but this activity does not make history, nor does it alter the plot. The user has no impact on the destiny of the virtual world. In the ontological mode, by contrast, the decisions of the user send the history of the virtual world on different forking paths. These decisions are ontological in the sense that they determine which possible world and consequently which story will develop from the situation in which the choice presents itself. Sounds a bit complicated, but then Ryan goes on to then form 4 groups, which I'll give then some examples. So on basis of these parameters, there are these 4 groups of not just games, but cybertext in general. If you're interested what cybertext is, then check out that video on Espen Arset's cybertext. Group 1, external/exploratory interactivity. In the text of this group, mostly classical hypertext, such as the novels of Michael Joyce, Stuart Moulthrop and Mark America, interactivity consists of the freedom to choose routes across a textual space, but this space has nothing to do with the physical space of a narrative setting. So this could be, of course, a book, but given the nature of cybertext, I think the internet itself or Wikipedia pages with its hyperlinks are a great example. Group 2, internal and exploratory interactivity. In the text of this category, to paraphrase Brenda Laurel, the user takes a virtual body with her into the fictional world, but her role in this world is limited to actions that have no bearing on the narrative events. These could be games such as Tekken or Super Mario. There we take charge of an avatar or a character and we traverse a field or fight a battle. We can have different moves that we take can take different actions as players, but the eventual outcome of the story or the event, like winning a fight, remains always the same. So regardless of how we traverse the game space, the outcome, so the history that emerges out of our gameplay, never changes. Group 3, external ontological interactivity. Here the user is like the omnipotent god of the system, holding the strings of the characters from a position external to both the time and space of the fictional world. He specifies their properties, makes decisions for them, throws obstacles in their way, and sends them toward different destiny lines by altering their environment. A great example would be the game Civilization, where we are in charge of a society. We decide the path that the society takes, whether it is violent, technological, or religious, and we see everything from this bird's eye perspective. So there we are, in a way, the god or the leader of this society. Group 4, internal ontological interactivity. The holodeck could be fully implemented. This is where it would belong. In the meantime, the category will have to be represented by computer games of the action and adventure type. It could be, for example, Mass Effect or Detroit Become Human. At that point where this paper was written, most likely games like Lara Croft or other games would have been considered, like Monkey's Island, even though the outcomes would be limited through the choices that the players could do. At this time, probably in 2000 or 2001, when this paper was written, games like Mass Effect or Detroit Become Human, where the choices that one does as a player has a huge impact on how the play unfolds and which history we write, so to speak, in comparison to Group 2, couldn't be anticipated. However, these games are perfect examples for this internal ontological interactivity. So, in conclusion, what Ryan does is to contest narratological approaches towards games by shifting the focus to the interface between player and system, meaning that instead of assuming that games hold this or that narrative and that this is the core of the game, the research done by scholars should first start by identifying which form of control players have over the game and how does the game respond to the player's input, or simply put, to the player's interaction.